is coming in from the waiting room. So we want to welcome all of you. Thank you all for making time to be with us today. I'm here at this Wellesley Career Education Alumni Connections webinar with Tere Remos. I'm Destiny Barletta. I am the Director for Alumni Connections in our team here in Wellesley Career Education. And I am joined by two colleagues who make up our team. And I will let both of them introduce themselves. I will then tell you a little about Tere, and she can take it away. We will get started pretty quickly.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Welcome. I'm Becky King.
Hi, I'm Dana Keep, and we're two of the Alumni Career Advisors. Great to see you all.
I will introduce briefly Tere, and as I said, I'll do that pretty quickly because she has a full session for us. So as you all should see when you came in, this session is being recorded. So we will make it available to those who might not be able to join us after the fact, which is a thing we are glad to be able to do. Tere is a wonderful Wellesley alum in the class of 1993. She's had many roles over the past 20 years in the intersection of disability rights, ADA education, and is an attorney by training. She currently is the executive director for Partners for Youth with Disabilities and is an expert on language access rights regarding limited English proficient students with disabilities. And she has really committed her career to seeking access for equal opportunities for individuals with disabilities in underrepresented communities and those who are often underserved by our established systems. So she brings really an immense amount of knowledge and expertise, and we're very grateful for her willingness to share that with our Wellesley community. I will let Tere go ahead and take the reins.
Yeah, thank you, Destiny. I hope I don't let everybody down after that introduction. Let's see, I am going to start my PowerPoint, and I'm going to start with some very basic ground rules. Let's see how I can move this around to make sure that I can actually, sorry guys, I'm trying to, there it is. Okay, perfect. Slideshow. So a few ground rules. We're going to have everybody put their questions on the chat. The purpose of that is both for the flow of the PowerPoint as well as guarding your privacy. At the end of the presentation, we will have someone read the questions rather than having the alums themselves do it. We also ask that in terms of respecting your privacy, when you write a question, you try to make it as broad of a question as possible so it serves the whole community. I know a lot of you probably have a lot of very specific questions based on our own life experiences. So I'm always open to to help folks. My email is at the beginning of the presentation. You can find me on Facebook and a whole bunch of Facebook Wellesley groups that often people post and they say, can someone talk to me? I'm always glad to be a peer resource rather than the attorney and record for you. So feel free to reach out that way if you have something very specific. So I am going to move us from here. Let's see, I always have why is this not moving? Let's see, there it is. Okay, so I'm gonna start, there's three parts to this presentation. Being a lawyer, I always feel that the policy and the implementation of a policy is very much rooted on a law or a regulation, right? So very often folks ask a question and they say, why am I not getting a response? And it's like, well, you have to go back to, to where it started and why we're doing this. So I'm going to explain the law, the ADA. I'm going to explain what the regulations say about accommodations. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about creating inclusivity, disability inclusivity in the workplace, because I'm hoping that I'm not only speaking to the choir here, folks that want the accommodations, but that there's also alums that hire employees and that manage folks and that can understand better how to make sure that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we include disability as part of that life experience that is diverse and important in our communities. So why is inclusion important? If you look at this, and I think that this is from 2018, But if you look at the number, I live in Massachusetts, of folks that are disabled as the percentage of employed persons is about 38% for Massachusetts compared to about 35% in the United States. What that means is whether you know a person or has a disability or not in your office is there's probably more than one. So again, this presentation, not everybody asks for accommodations, but that does not mean that you don't have to think about this and work and think about ways of creating more accessibility and universal design. So I am going to start explaining Section 504. Section 504 was the first civil right law in the United States targeting disability rights. And it really came at the heels of the civil rights movement. Can everybody mute their, if everybody can mute their Zoom, that would be really great, because otherwise it gets really hard for some.
Wait, Terry, you were muted by accident.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I just unmuted myself. I appreciate that. So Section 504 comes in the heels of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. A large number of Vietnam vets come back. They're disabled. They see what's happened with some communities in the United States, with Black communities, and they say, we need access as well. It was very contentious at the time, but the gist of Section 504, as you're going to see in the next slide, is that it's limited to recipients of federal funding. But what it really created, which is really important, is that it protected what they called qualified individuals from discrimination based on a disability. And again, language is really important. I had a law professor that said that the most important thing in the law was semantic hygiene. That's how he called it. So how it's written, what it says is really important. In this case, you have to be a qualified individual. And a qualified individual is a person that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And you're going to be hearing about this limiting of a one or major life activity throughout our presentation. It became a basic tenet of all of our disability laws in the country. So a major life activity, it's actually really broad. As you can see, it can be walking, it can be breathing, it can be seeing. And again, as I explained, the way that Section 504 was ultimately negotiated and allowed to pass, what it had to be just employers and organizations that received federal assistance. So hospitals, schools, government organizations, and for those organizations, it forbid organizations from excluding or denying individuals equal opportunity. So this Section 504 is all about access. So then comes the ADA. It took from 1973 until 1990 to pass a comprehensive disability rights law in this country that would look at and allow for equal access of individuals based on disability. So the ADA covers most establishments, whether they're private or publicly funded. So this is a picture from when the ADA was passed, July 26, 1990. It's pretty incredible that I was born in 1971 and it took until I was in college to have a comprehensive disability law to pass. Okay, so I'm sorry, someone keeps calling my phone. There you go. Okay, so what is the ADA? First passed in 1990 by Congress, and it's intended to provide a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discriminations for individuals with disabilities. And it's been amended several times, but if you look at the ADA, it really is much broader, and it's supposed to cover every part of society where a person needs to have access. So the idea is that we can benefit from all goals and programs and opportunities. It also provides architectural standards. I'm sorry. All right. So what's in the ADA? The ADA has 5 sections, and we're going to be talking about only one section today, which is employment. If you work or you deal with state and local government or businesses and nonprofits, there's other areas of the ADA. But again, today I'm going to tell you all about Title I of the ADA, not the other ones, because it's very, very thorough. I'm sorry, someone must be having an emergency, but I'm going to make sure that it doesn't happen again. I apologize. Okay, so Title I applies to companies of 15 or more employees. If you work in a mom and pop shop and they have 2 people, the Title I of the ADA and what I'm going to talk about today, unfortunately, does not apply to you. It prohibits discrimination not only in the person that's already working there, but it also protects you when you're interviewing for the job. And it protects in terms of not only the work in itself, but also your pay and other benefits and employment. And it restricts questions that can be asked about the application process, about disability in the application process, although I'm going to explain some caveats to that are really important. It requires reasonable accommodations unless there is an undue hardship. And again, I'm going to get into the details of that. And if you work for a religious entity with 15 or more employees, they're also covered under Title I of the ADA. Okay, so as I said before, when Section 504 was passed, we talked about having a qualified individual being protected. In the ADA, it's no different. You are protected and you're considered to have a disability if you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. If you have a record of that impairment or you're regarded in having that impairment. And this is really important because folks often will have a disability that it's not diagnosed, that they have never sought care, that they have never tried to really document. And according to the ADA, you can still get protection for it if you're regarded as having that impairment. So physical and mental impairment, I am not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but I mean, if you read this closely, it is very, very thorough, right? Any physiological condition, cosmetic disfigurement, neurological, musculoskeletal, endocrine, anything that has to deal with your body on your mind is covered under the ADA. And in terms of a major life activity, again, the courts have been really general. Basically, anything that has to do with your body, reading, thinking, processing information, trying to do work, it's all covered as long as it substantially limits that life activity, it's covered under the ADA. And the courts have also determined that the determination of the impairment and whether it limits a major life activity needs to be made without regard to what they call ameliorative effects of mitigating measures. So for example, if you have a hearing aid and you can hear okay, because you have that hearing aid, but you do have an impairment, a hearing impairment that really substantially limits a life activity. So you can't go to the movies, you can't hear microphones through a loudspeaker. You can't sit in a room in the back and take part of a meeting in the back of the room without that hearing aid. You also have the protection of the ADA. So, and that's really important because often employees go to the employer and say, I need help. I need, for example, I need a card interpreter for our presentation. We're doing a training. Could you have a card interpreter because I cannot hear the microphone well? And the person will say, but you have a hearing aid and you can hear me when we're talking face to face. Why do you need this extra expense for the office? Well, this is why. If you need it, even though you have something that ameliorates your condition, it's still valid. Okay, so with that basic frame in mind and understanding again that in order for you to get accommodations and under the ADA, you need to have the disability substantially limit a major life activity, and that you either need to have it be diagnosed, recognized, or be regarded as having a disability. I'm going to continue now and talk a little bit about what the accommodations in the workplace should look like, or what the law says it should look like. So the first thing that's really important is, what is a reasonable accommodation? And this is really important because very often what happens, and when the information breaks down between the employer and the employee, is that what the employee is asking, the employer sees as not being reasonable. So Sadly, the description or the definition of what is reasonable under the regulations is that it is reasonable if it seems reasonable on its face. That's not really great. That's not, whoever was drafting this is not on their A game that day. But basically, if a court is going to look at it, they're going to look at it on its face and say, does it sound reasonable? Does it seem reasonable? And if it does, you've got yourself a reasonable accommodation. They have to provide it. And again, what is reasonable? If it appears to be feasible or plausible. So if I work in a small company and I live, if I am in a building that is 300 years old and it would take, historical commission and millions of dollars in order to be able to install a ramp, it may not be feasible. Or, if you move the stairs, the whole house crumbles, and that may not be feasible. But if I say, I need a piece of technological equipment that, by having a small investment, you can do it, then that's probably feasible. The accommodation needs to be effective in meeting the needs of the individual. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the process of requesting accommodations tends to be an interactive process. And part of what it's clearly stated over and over is that it has to be effective. The term effective is used continually, meaning if I offer something to you as the employer saying, I'm willing to give you this, and this does not work for you, then I am not providing a reasonable accommodation to you. It's not working out. The last thing is to look at costs. And that's really important because we're going to talk about what is called an undue burden. And usually the undue burdens tend to be tied to budget costs. If you are working in an organization with 16 individuals, that is, let's say, a shoestring nonprofit with a budget of $50,000, and you need to buy a piece of equipment that costs $30,000 in order to do your job, then the cost of that equipment in order to grant the accommodation is not really reasonable. So it's very much based on the size, the resources, and the way that that employer is set up. Okay, so undue hardship. So this is the only limitation that really exists in the scope of what is a reasonable accommodation. And again, undue hardship is an umbrella for a few terms. Is it feasible? Is it plausible? Does it create an economic hardship for the employer? Is it very difficult to accomplish or very expensive to accomplish? The courts usually look at that and say, how difficult is it to get this, or how expensive is it to do this for an employer? So it focuses on the resources of the organization and the circumstances and the organization and the relationship to provide that accommodation. And if it finds that it's really hard, then that's an undue hardship and the person does not have to do it. I'm going to give you an example. For many years, the Cambridge Disability Commission has tried to work with businesses around Central Square. Because if you go to Central Square, there's a lot of sidewalks, and then all of the businesses have a very small step in order to get into the store. Well, the problem was that a lot of the businesses claimed an undue hardship because the architectural barriers and the architectural board says that a ramp needs to have a 1-inch rise for every 12 inches. So you just can have a very short and very steep ramp. It's not going to help the person. It's too steep. It needs to be long. But if your business is right at the edge of where the Cambridge sidewalk begins, and it's a very small sidewalk, the city of Cambridge is not going to grant them the permit to put in that ramp, and it's going to be incredibly expensive to do so. So therefore, it's considered an undue hardship. So it's an unfortunate situation for the business and the customers that want to go in but can't because of physical limitations. Again, is it disruptive? Does it fundamentally alter the nature or the operation of a business? I'm going to give you an example that it's not business, but it explains altering the nature of an operation. There was there was a federal court case of a student who sued the school district because they wanted to be part of the cross-country team, but they were in a wheelchair. So they asked that the race be modified from going through the woods into a more easier to traverse area for a person in a wheelchair. And what the court determined was that if you have if you do track and field, you do it in an easy to traverse area. You do it in in the stadium, in the area, and the running area. But if you have cross country, you are supposed to go through the nature trails, and that is the fundamental idea of cross country, right? So they said, no, that is not a reasonable request for an accommodation, and they lost the case. This has to be, so every disability accommodation request needs to be done in a case-by-case basis. They cannot say, oh, someone already came and asked me about that, and I said no. That is not a proper response for anyone seeking an accommodation. So let's say that you come to the Wellesley at Career Education, you're looking for a job, you get a call back for an interview, and you want to interview, but you need an accommodation, right? You're doing it through Zoom, and you're hard of hearing, and you need to be able to have captions or other supports in order to be able to doing the hiring. The employer has to provide a reasonable accommodation if the person is qualified. So if I were to choose that person out of the pile of resumes, regardless of the disability, before I knew that person had a disability, I said, wow, this person's resume is stellar, I want to interview them, then they have to provide an accommodation so that person is able to interview. And the employer can ask you if you need a reasonable accommodation. You can offer it and you can request it, but they can also ask you, and it's okay to answer yes or no. You don't have to explain to them what your disability is, and we're going to go through this as well when we talk about doing the actual reasonable accommodation process. What they need to know is basically, what is the accommodation and how is your life, what is the life activity? How is it in many ways diminished? How would that accommodation help you get the access? So don't go into medical diagnoses, don't go into details of your file, don't provide that information, just give them enough information. So for example, you can say, my hard of hearingness prevents me from listening clearly to several applicants who are speaking in a room when I'm doing Zoom. So I would appreciate if you could add captioning to the Zoom meeting so I am able to read it as well as listen to everybody in the room. So if you meet the initial requirements to be considered for the job, you cannot be excluded from the application process because you need an accommodation or because there's speculation thinking, gee whiz, if I gave that person that accommodation, are they not going to be able to perform the job, or are they going to be too expensive to hire? That is not legal. So if the person has any questions, you can tell them and say, this is all I need at the moment. If I were to be hired because I am qualified, we can then talk about the needs, but please do not speculate on the cost or my reasonable accommodation. I know this is a very touchy subject, so, and I'm going to get a little bit more about this, right? A lot of people say, do I disclose my disability to an interview? People often post on Facebook saying, I'm interviewing and I want to let them know that I am so anxious. So here's the story. If this is a Pandora's box, you open it, you will have a harder time closing it than if you just don't open it, okay? The employer cannot ask you about your disability needs or any reasonable accommodations when you're in the hire process and before a conditional offer is made. But if you tell the employer about your disability and about reasonable accommodations, then they can ask you questions about making sure that you can perform the specific job functions. So again, it has to be about the specific job functions. It cannot be beyond the job functions. If the person knows that you have a disability or you have voluntarily disclosed it, then that conversation is open to happen. So for example, I interview someone, they come in, they're blind, they need to navigate the office to get there. I can ask them questions and say, Your job requires you to work off-site on some days and do visits to schools and programs. Are you, what kind of accommodations would I need to do to make sure that you can get safely to that job site, or do you have a way to get to that job site on your own? So that is specific to my job requirement, but I cannot ask him and be like, gee whiz, you're blind, like, you know, how do you do your job? Like, can you like be part of my office? Like, you cannot be asked those general type of questions. All right, moving on. Let's say that that you do get this job, and then you think I need some accommodations to be able to have full access to my job and perform the essential functions of the job. And I am using those words very specifically because part of what the ADA is very clear is that a person that is hired still needs to be able to perform the essential functions of the job. So I went to law school because math was not my jive, okay? I think 98% of lawyers go to law school because they could never be accountants, right? Except tax lawyers. Tax lawyers show up with a calculator to class. The rest of us, not so much, right? If I were to be hired for an accounting job, if I applied, whether I have a disability or not, the truth is that I cannot perform the essential functions of that job because I cannot do math to save my life, right? So whether I have a disability or not, I cannot perform those essential functions. That is off the table. In this case, if I were hired, if I had a disability and I were hired to do disability law, and I am able to perform the essential functions of the job, then they have to provide those reasonable accommodations. Okay, so I just want to make that distinction. That's really important. You need to let the employer know that you're going to need some adjustment or some accommodation related to your condition. You can use plain English. You do not need to use any specific wording. You do not need to mention the ADA. You don't need to say, I need a reasonable accommodation. You can just say, case in point, using the same hypothetical blind employee. I am blind. I am unable to drive. I will need to be refunded or be allowed use of a car share in order to get to specific events that go from the office to that event. That's good enough. That's a request, right? It tells me, right? It tells me what your limitation is. What is the limitation to your major life activity? I can't drive. It tells me what I need to do to accommodate you. And then it's supposed to be an interactive process that clarifies the needs, right? I could decide and say, well, gee whiz, my employee can take the ride, which is a service in Boston for individuals with disabilities where they call a phone number and the ride comes and gives them a ride somewhere else rather than taking the T. Except if I were to have this interactive process, my employee would say, the ride is not really an option when I have to rush to a meeting in the middle of the day, because the ride, you have to schedule it in advance, and they tend to be between half an hour and an hour late. And that's going to make me late for work meetings. And that's not going to look really good on the company's appearance, right? So doing the ride share, it's much more effective, both in terms of time saving and being professional. If I don't do that process, I may come to a conclusion that is wrong, which is take the ride. I posted here, and I'm glad, I don't know if one of the staff at the at Career Education can copy that link, but if you can copy that guidance and or we can send it to folks afterwards. There is a guidance from the EEOC that is really, really good in explaining all of the enforcement guidance that I am talking about today. So more on this process. The employer can ask you relevant questions that it's going to allow them to understand and make an informed decision about the request. So again, I can ask the person, do you just never drive? Are you able to drive in the daytime, but not at night? Are you able to drive short distances? You know, just tells me what are the limitations? How far do I need to go in the accommodation? What kind of solutions do I need to look? I can ask about the nature of the disability, but I cannot ask about other health conditions or the regular, you know, medical record. So I can also, the employer should not disclose to workers or anybody what this employee has been talking about in terms of the disability. What a lot of organizations do is that they have a point person in the HR department that is the person that deals with the process, and they often ask you to put it in writing, and they document it just to professionalize it, to make sure that they have a record that if they leave the job, the next person already understands what the interactive process was and you need to start again. So just because they write it down or they ask you to write it down, don't think about it negatively. It could actually be a good thing that it's already there and that you have already potentially submitted something. You don't need to submit documentation. That was my next slide. So they can ask for reasonable documentation about the functional limitations. That is something that they can ask. But, and if you don't submit it, they can say, we don't really understand what are your functional limitations. We don't have any information. I should say that a lot of companies or organizations traditionally has asked for medical documentation. Medical documentation is what's written into the EEOC guidelines. There is a big shift in the part of many organizations towards more social justice. There is an understanding and a recognition that some underserved communities do not have the same access to medical care, to experts, to support as individuals that come from wealthier or wealthier groups, or maybe specific demographics. So they can ask for some documentation. So for example, when I have worked at organizations where I am the employer and I ask for some documentation that explain to me what are your functional limitations. I accept school IEPs, I accept notes from a therapist rather than requesting a full neuropsych or psychological evaluation. I accept letters from the primary care physician. A person, if you're a veteran, you can provide your veteran affairs record that explains, what is the disability and how it has a functional limitation. So the employer can request some form of the documentation so they understand better what your disability entails, but they cannot ask for the complete medical record. And if the documentation is insufficient and it does not specify the existence of a disability, they may ask that you need to provide something that does explain that, because at the end, that's what they're looking for, right? What is the disability and what is the need for that accommodation? What is not required? They cannot ask for documentation when the disability and the need for a reasonable accommodation are obvious. So for example, that blind employee that comes to me, I had an employee many years ago who's deaf. He's deaf. He has been deaf since birth. He went to a traditional deaf university. He's embedded in deaf culture. He is profoundly deaf, so he does not use any kind of vocal, he does not speak other than using ASL. That is his language. And I found it ridiculous that he got to the organization that we worked with, and they wanted all sorts of medical and past documentation of his disability. I'm like, by now, this grown man with a PhD should know what are his functional limitations and how they work. So this is not a person that is trying to get over. He's just asking for an ASL interpreter. I think that's a pretty reasonable expectation given that that is his language, right? And that is the case for an organization. If it's obvious, you can go back to them and say, this is my disability. I think it's pretty obvious to you. Or if you have already provided sufficient information to substantiate it, then the employer cannot keep pushing you and keep asking for more information. Again, if they don't provide you the reasonable accommodation and they're still asking, you may want to just write back and say, this is where in the record it explains what is my functional limitation and what I need in order to get the access. Just kind of digest it for them. Can the employer make me go to their doctor? This is a big question that we get. The ADA does not prevent an employer from requiring an individual to go to the doctor. That's unfortunate. that usually happens when, or can only happen if there is insufficient information from the treating physician or other professional. So I'll give you an example. I worked at a setting where a lot of individuals would ask for accommodation, and they would provide really vague letters, often from nurses, all sorts of very random people, right? And it would not really explain what was the functional limitation and how the disability really limited a life activity and what we needed to do. So we would direct the person in saying, you can go to health services. We have a group of physicians and a group of therapists, and you can meet with them, and they will have access to your medical record that we don't have access to, so they can read it. And then they can provide us with a letter that truly explains what we need in order to provide this accommodation. So that is something that they can do. Again, it needs to be limited, the information that is given and the context of this visit to the doctor, to the request of the disability, and it cannot kind of seep into other areas of your health record. Do you get to choose your accommodation? This is a very common question. So you made the request, you had the interactive process, and then the employer says, this is what I'm going to provide you. So for example, let's say my deaf employee, he came and he said, I need a deaf interpreter. Everybody in my office is hearing. How do I communicate with everybody and hold meetings? And the employer says, no. I've decided that I'm going to put a chat feature on your computer, and you can just chat with everybody. Is that a reasonable accommodation? And does the employer get to make that decision? As long as that accommodation is effective, they can do that. In the case of this hearing, this deaf person I'm explaining, that's in no way a reasonable accommodation, because deaf culture has a very specific way of writing grammar, and it's completely inconsiderate to tell someone that they can never look at a coworker in the face and just have a conversation. Rather, they have to type it into a computer. So you need to be able to give feedback. And again, you have to remember that it has to be a reasonable accommodation. So if there are two options and one costs more, or it's more difficult to implement, or it's more burdensome, the employer is able to choose the less expensive one. And if you and you have to accept it as long as it is effective. So if you don't like the cheaper option and you think, oh, they're being cheap, you have to not go to them and say, this is a cheap option. You just don't want to pay for the ASL interpreter that is more expensive. You have to be able to explain why this is not effective. Deaf culture, is grammatically different. This is not a good way to create rapport with my employees. Just explain why it's not effective. All right, next slide. So what do workplace accommodations cover? It covers a whole host of things. People just don't understand. I mean, if you think about it, you spend a lot of your waking hours of the day in the job, and therefore it's designed to give you the same access as your coworkers without disabilities have to that job. So it shouldn't cover any in-house or outside training. If you go to an outside training and they're paying, you need to make sure that your
You're
employer,
muted.
Am I muted? Someone just said you're muted. I don't know why my it came into my earphones and said you're muted. Please unmute. That's really random. I'm sorry. So let's say that you are that deaf employee and you're going to an outside training and you need a card interpreter, or you need an ASL interpreter. You want to go to your employer and say, thank you for letting me go to this conference. I'm going to need an interpreter for those trainings. If you have a training in the office and you need to take breaks, to walk around the room, to arrive a little later, to leave a little earlier, to have a special chair in order to not end up at the PT because you sat in really bad training chairs. All of those things are covered under the accommodations. If you have leave and it's paid leave, they cannot deny you the use of that accrued paid leave when you have a disability. Or if you have unpaid leave and you ask for it and you say, I have this disability, I need to take time off for the following disability reasons, they cannot deny you that request for the unpaid leave if it's based on a disability need. If you ask for unpaid leave as a reasonable accommodation, the employer must have what they call a no-fault leave policy that allows the employee to have that extra leave. So for example, let's say that I go on maternity leave and it's unpaid. And while I am on maternity leave, I develop postpartum depression. So I need to extend my unpaid leave so I can sort out and get the help I need for my postpartum depression. The employer needs to grant me that unpaid leave related to my disability, right? It's different if I say I want unpaid leave because I want to stay home with my baby versus I need the unpaid leave because I have this disability, unless it causes undue hardship. So let's say that, you have 16 people and you run a program that, you are the utmost and only expert in the world on that very only subject, and you happen to have the nuclear codes to the United States nuclear system, and you're the only person in the whole United States that have these codes, and staying for 3 more months would cause undue hardship and potential elimination of the North American continent. When someone sends the nuclear codes, then maybe that's a hardship and they say, no, I'm sorry, you cannot stay longer. But in that case, remember, there is an interactive process. Just don't take no. See how you can work with our employer to make sure that at least you have as much access as possible. Which brings me to modified schedules. Let's say that they say, no, you have the nuclear codes. You have to come to work at least an hour to make sure that the nuclear codes are current and that if there's a threat, we can take care of it, right? So you can ask, please hold open my job, again, unless it's a hardship, and please modify my schedule. You can adjust arrival or departure time. So blind employee, case in point, I need to leave earlier in the day while there's still daylight outside so I can make it home safe. And then I will continue and flex the hours and work the extra hour I need to complete my 8 hours of work at home. I need breaks in order to be able to walk around and not get back pain. You can alter when certain functions are performed. So for example, I have ADHD and it's really hard for me to perform certain things at the end of the day when I'm tired. Could I do, can I take care of these matters first thing in the morning? Could we set those meetings in the early morning? You can, again, talk about leave. You can allow the person to use accrued or unpaid leave. And you can use a modified or part-time schedule when it is, again, a reasonable accommodation. And you have to think about undue hardship. The employer cannot say, oh, it's a matter of equity. I cannot give you a modified part-time schedule because there's someone else who is a mom and wants a part-time schedule so she can go pick up her kids in school and stay home with them. That's great that she wants to do that. I am all for a healthy balance and supporting our parents in the workplace, but this is a disability accommodation. It's a different ballgame altogether. So job reassignments. If you have a job and you need an accommodation so you're not able to perform that job, you can be reassigned to a vacant position if that allows you to remain in the job, and that can be a reasonable accommodation. So for example, I am a UPS delivery person. My back gets really hurt. I cannot carry 40-pound loads anymore. And I ask, rather than leaving my job, is there a vacant position that I can take as a reasonable accommodation? And they say, sure, we need a phone customer service person. Would you be willing to shift to that job? So that vacant position has to be provided to an employee who can no longer perform the essential functions of the job. Here's a caveat. You have to be qualified for that new position, and it has to be equivalent in terms of pay status or other relevant factors. So if I come to my employer and say, I'm sorry, I cannot be a lawyer anymore and go to court because for whatever disability, they cannot say, here, take this accounting job. I am nowhere qualified for that job, right? Or if I say, I'm sorry, I cannot be a lawyer anymore, and they say, here, would you like to, we need someone to come in the evening and do the cleanup of the office. I am definitely qualified to clean things as a mom. I clean things 24/7, but it's not equivalent in terms of pay status or other factors, right? Unfortunately, we don't pay cleaning staff close to what they need to be paid, and definitely not close to what lawyers make. You cannot deny a reassignment to an employee because they are in a probationary status. So you cannot say, gee whiz, if you were in a full-time status, we could, but you're still in probation. That is not allowed. And the other thing is, and you know, I hear this one very often. My supervisor makes me very anxious. I need a reasonable accommodation to be supervised by another person. That is not something that is covered under the ADA. You do not have to be provided with a new supervisor just because of your disability. So I want to shift a little bit. I've told you a lot about what the law says and what you can go and ask and what employers need to think about. But we always want folks to think about, you know, people are just not a circle, they're a sphere, right? We have a lot of, we live in collaboration with others. We work in collaborations with others. We thrive when the work culture helps you thrive. And we succeed when the work culture brings in as much diversity and inclusion and the possibility for others to succeed. So I want to talk a little bit about the climate of inclusivity and how important that is in order to create a safe space for individuals with disabilities in the workplace. So when you talk about inclusion, again, it's a proactive approach and it has to be meaningful. So token advances of saying, oh, I'm going to give you that ride share, but then you come into the office and and that person gets constant negative energy from coworkers and does not feel like they're meaningfully engaged in their job, or they're not proactively engaged in being included. That is not an employee that's going to succeed or that's going to stay in the long term. So the investment that that company makes in that employee is going to be wasted. So what does that investment looks like in action? We actively need to be seeking out those with disabilities and inviting them into our circle. It will enrich everybody's experience to understand and know that person's identity. Again, identity not only as a person with a disability, but identity as a person. But disability is a core factor that makes us who we are. We want to emphasize representation of those with disabilities in our workforce to lift them up and understand that they are included, that they're an essential part of that organization. And it's important that we all learn more about disability. So I am grateful for all of you that came today that do not have a disability, but want to learn more in order to be able to widen that circle, because, you know, it's part of the homework that we do, and again, in understanding how important inclusivity is. So for organizations that are looking to be proactive and meaningful in bringing up the inclusivity, the first step is you need to assess what is your organization's climate around disability. So you want to know that the leadership has buy-in, that they truly believe in those inclusion efforts. Any employee that comes in gets a reasonable accommodation, but does not see that they're valued, that the leadership understands why their perspective in life is important, is not going to feel like a valued employee, and it's not going to be as invested as others. So you want to make this everyone to understand why there is buy-in and commitment, and we want to get it from all segments of the organization. You want to look at the organizational climate about disability. Are you providing these accommodations, but then the climate around them does not support them? And are you and you want to establish a baseline to understand how many individuals with disabilities belong to the organization. We, in my office, we did an end of year anonymous survey to all staff. We are 32 people in my office, and we did an anonymous survey to understand what were the life experiences of those in our office. And I discovered that half my staff identify as having a disability. Now, I mean, you'd think, oh, well, she works for a disability rights organization. Yes, but that doesn't mean that the person needs to have a disability. Half of my staff do not have it, right? But it helps me understand when I do events and when I do everything, how do I have to make sure that those individuals with disabilities feel included, and how do I bring in those that don't have it so they understand the experience. The second one is you want to revise and examine what are your program policies that supports an inclusive practice. So you want to create a public inclusion statement, just like you did a racial equity statement. You want to look at policies related to bullying and harassment. It is no surprise to folks to know that individuals with disabilities get bullied at a much higher rate than other individuals. And you want to guard against that. There is always a power structure in the workplace, and it only becomes more evident when there is a person with a visible disability in the workforce. You want to look and make sure that there's physical and other accessibility in your office. Are you making, there's a reason why I made this PowerPoint, very bland white with black. It gives contrast. Those of you that need it can see it. I don't need it, but it's super helpful because I'm able to see it. But what kind of accessibility can you build into your office to make sure that folks of all walks of life can really gather in? And there's a lot of really interesting work on universal design that helps all individuals, whether they have a disability or not. And then you want to offer robust training on professional development on disability issues to your staff. So you do want to provide potentially an ADA, PowerPoint or training so people understand how to ask for accommodations and others understand why it's not proper to be asking others, why do you have this accommodation? Why are you doing things differently? It's none of your business, right? So you wanna train your staff to understand better what is going on. And then the third one is you want to sustain it. We see a lot of people that they do a training, they do this one-time thing, and then it's like they forget. It's like, it's like it was meant to be a token moment in time. So any gain that you do can be really undone without engaging the practices and sustaining them over time. So sometimes I'll go somewhere and I'll see something, say, oh yeah, we did that because we had a blind employee. And I'm like, you're not doing it anymore? They're like, no, we don't think we need it. I'm like, well, why do you think no one else who's blind has applied to the job? Maybe you need to show them how inclusive you are towards blind people. And then more people who are blind will be compelled to join your company and be a part of it. So you want to create an accessibility and accommodations budget. So when that person needs an accommodation, you're like, oh my God, all of a sudden I have to spend $3,000 on this. Well, if you had in the budget a little bit of cushion for this, it would not be such a surprise. You want to form partnerships with local disability organizations and agencies. So you are an active member of the community, in the disability community, and you are engaged and they know that you're an ally to them in this community. You want to conduct periodic assessments to understand if your policies are in line with what needs to happen and how is your organization supporting your staff. And you need to address any incidents of bullying or discrimination quickly and thoroughly. There's nothing that pushes people away from their job more than when they get completely deflated and they go to someone and say, this happened to me, please protect me, please make me feel like a valued member of the staff, and they get no response. So I have all of these resources. If the staff are okay, I'm okay that you guys forward the PowerPoint for everybody so they can take a look. And I am glad to take any questions. We only have 5 minutes, but if people need to stay for a minute or two, I'm glad to look at it. So I see we have 10 questions in the chat. I don't know. I will stop sharing so we can see each other. And I don't know, do one of you guys want to read them?
Yes, I can read them. And also, we will share using the emails that folks registered for the webinar with, the slides and then the resources on that last page. If you would like a different email, you can just reach out to my email and let me know where to send it. I'll put my email in the chat. So for the first question, I'll kind of work my way up. In online job applications, they ask if you have a disability. They say they won't use the answer against the applicant in the hiring decision. And if a disability is invisible, then they obviously won't be able to see that. Should the applicant say no or decline to say because for all, you might know they actually can use it against you. So like, what's the benefit of disclosing if they ask if your disability is invisible?
Yeah. So for most large organizations that ask you to upload the information through a portal, they do not see that information. It's really for reporting purposes. The Department of Justice often looks at the workforce and the EEOC, and this is how they know a lot of the numbers of how many people apply for jobs who have disabilities versus the number that gets them. So I have never been afraid of saying, should I say yes? Because again, it's more for demographics and reporting. If someone were to ask you more directly, or if it was not a form, then I would be more suspicious of it.
Question, can accommodations be applied to requirements for the job description, such as like a requirement to be able to lift a certain amount? Like, can a person with an ADA disability request accommodations for something that's a part of the job requirement?
So that job requirement is the essential function of the job I was talking about. If your job essential function says you should be able to lift 40 pounds and you cannot lift 40 pounds, you cannot be, they don't have to hire you and they don't have to provide you an accommodation because it's an essential function of the job. When you have that job with that function and all of a sudden you cannot do it, that's when you can ask for a reassignment, right? If they say, this is the UPS person that I was saying, right? An essential function of being the UPS carrier is you need to be able to lift 40 pounds. All of a sudden you can't do it. That is an essential function of someone being a UPS carrier. So they can say, you cannot do an essential function of your job anymore. Let me offer you another one, but they don't have to hire you or interview you if they know that you cannot perform the essential function of a job.
A couple of people have interest in what to do if a manager responds to a reasonable accommodation request that has been officially submitted. So they acknowledge that they received the request, but then the kind of accommodation or solution was never implemented.
So I would go back and say, I want to revisit this. I needed this accommodation. And if it really doesn't happen, then there should be a commission against discrimination in every state. And you can file a complaint and say, I need these. And, you want to keep, this is why they say you don't have to make them in writing. As a lawyer, my personal mantra of life is if it's not in writing, it never happened. So keep it in writing, right? Write back very amicably and say, we talked about, I submitted documentation. We talked about this. It was never implemented. Can you let me know? Are you working on this? Because part of what the ADA regulations in the EEOC do say is that if they fail to implement them, but they're making an effort to implement them, they're still in compliance. So for example, if I buy a computer for that blind employee and it needs a specific software, and the specific software just takes 2 weeks to arrive, but I ordered it, I'm in compliance. It's just by no fault of my own that there's that delay. But if that employer didn't really make the effort to do it, then that's on them. So you want to write back and say, can you tell me what's going on? Was there a delay? If it's like an equipment or anything, when do you think it'll get here? And if you get no response or they don't do it, then go to the disability discrimination and make a complaint. Can I add, if you make a complaint to the disability discrimination, they cannot retaliate against you. It's against the law. So in many ways, people are sometimes afraid to go to the disability commission to complain because they're like, oh my God, my employer is gonna push me out. They're gonna fire me. It's like just the opposite. Just by virtue of going there, your job is a lot more secure than if you try to like just DIY this on your own.
A question about things like modified schedules. So if a modified schedule is a part of a kind of acceptable accommodation, should you anticipate being paid for those breaks, or are the breaks something that you would need to take like leave for?
That's a very good question. I'd have to look into the specific regulations. There's nothing in the EEOC that specifically say that. I think it depends on how long the break is, right? If you need to take an hour break between hours, so you're effectively only working half time, I'm supposing that it would be reasonable for the employer to ask that you make up that time. If you're just taking a 5-10 minute break, which would be comparable to what other employees take, then I can't imagine that that would be an issue that you'd be made to be paid back. But again, I think it often depends on the function of the job and where you're working. And you know, I'm afraid to tell you one way or the other because I don't know the exact answer, but I think I'm supposing that the devil's in the details on the job and the kind of work that you're doing and all that.
I'm just going through to see if there are other kind of salient questions.
Someone asked, does that apply to applying to colleges as well? So
Right.
so in the application process, if you need an accommodation, so for example, you go visit the admissions office and you need an ASL interpreter for the info session, yes, that applies. Colleges also, Section 504 also applies to colleges because they're recipients of federal financial funds, you know, funds from the federal government. When you get to Wellesley, it's not Title I that applies because Title I is for employment. But the same principle of undue hardship, reasonable accommodations, and the interactive process are in the base of what you do with student accessibility services. So when you go to student accessibility services and say, I need these reasonable accommodations to have equal and meaningful access to the life at the university. So for example, a private room or a room that is accessible, or I need software to be able to record my lectures and all that would be done using the same principles that I have explained of determining what is the limitations on the functioning of your daily living, what is your disability, and what do you need in order for it to be a reasonable accommodation to have access to that schoolwork.
Excellent. Okay, final question. What do you think might be the best approach if your condition is unpredictable and you don't know for sure what accommodations you might need, or those accommodations are in flux?
So that's a hard question that happens very often to people. I think the first thing is so if you're working with a professional, the first thing you need to do is you yourself with a professional need to figure out what is your functional limitation. What gets in the way of you doing the job without any kind of limitation, and then work your way to that, right? So you may do that. You may be able to speak to some of your clinicians or doctors and ask. Very often they have, maybe sometimes they have their own suggestions. It's part of the work that they do, providing professional recommendations, because it's just as they say, you need a brace or you need physical therapy, they're able to provide you recommendations in order, it will ameliorate your condition. So looking to those experts is it's a good starting point. I think also looking at your limitations and your own self-awareness and understanding what makes it better and what makes it worse, right? A doctor you don't need a doctor to tell you potentially which seating position you feel more comfortable in, or what kind of time of the day you feel sharper, or how do you learn better? Like, right? Are you a person that's listening to me or is looking at the PowerPoint? And let some of that self-awareness guide you in terms of what you think you need in order to be able to do the job. So that's a part. And I think if it's in flux, that is where that interactive process comes in. So for example, you're all of a sudden diagnosed with a degenerative eye condition, and right now you can see, but you don't know how far it can go, right? It could lead to total blindness. Just being upfront with your, just saying, this is where I am now. And when you get to that next step and need a different accommodation, then you re-engage that process with your employer and say, here's new medical information that tells you how my accommodations need to pivot.
Thank you. It's possible we missed a question or two, and if so, Tere kindly offered that you could email. So we'll share the information via email with those who registered, and I put my email there. So if you'd like an additional email added to the distribution list, we are glad to do that. Tere, thank you so much for your time. I think that the questions really indicated how people really want to engage with this information and learn more. So we really appreciate your expertise and your leading this conversation, which is an important one.